potential misunderstanding about Jesus. I mean, there's all these things that you've got to do, and we're going to talk a little bit about that just by telling our story. And we're going to be encouraging you to just pay attention to how we address similar challenges in different ways, and how we apply similar principles in different ways. And so, fundamentally, I want to just kind of set up a little bit of what we do share in common. We're part of a group of churches called Soma. Soma is the Greek word for body. And Leon's church is just coming into that family with us because we realize we have a whole lot in common, and we should be working together. Our desire is to see every major city in North America have a church planting work that's committed to saturating the context with gospel-centered people. We want to see one missional community per 1,000 people in every major city in North America. So Chicago, 2.7 million, that's 2,700 missional communities. That comes from church planting research that says that the tipping point towards a movement in a city or a place around the world is when you get one church per 1,000 people. And for us, our fundamental conviction is that if you're going to reduce church down to its most effective means of making disciples, it's a missional community. It's a people, we're going to define that in just a sec, but a people committed to life together on mission in the everyday. We both believe strongly in the gathering of the saints in a weekly manner, or pulling them together to encourage and exhort and proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ and take communion together, remember Him as central to all we do. So we'll talk about how that works and how it even works differently and how we started. But what we do share in common is that conviction that if people aren't in a missional community in daily life together, they won't really grow up as disciples who can make disciples. And so I talked on that yesterday. Some of you weren't here, so I'll just define what we believe a missional community could be defined as. And of course, we even at times will use different language because of different culture on how we define it. And then you'll even hear it. So I want you to kind of put on the learner hat of saying, okay, how does Leon's talk differently than Jeff does about the same idea? That's actually the work you'll need to do, by the way, if you're ever going to do effective missionary work in your context, is go, what's the language of our people? What are they meaning when they say something? For instance, when people say Christian in the Northwest, it means an entirely different thing than someone in the Bible Belt. Guaranteed. Okay? So that same word does not have the same meaning. It's another language. And you have to get to know what that means in order to speak intelligently about these things. So you're even going to hear that probably with us. You go, wait a minute, what he said is different than what Jeff said. No, he's using different language and a different culture, applying it in a different way, but it's got the same principles. So I want to define missional community. For us, the way we've defined missional community, if you weren't with us yesterday, we unpacked it quite a bit in the first session. We tried to record it, and if you want to get access to that, you can go to this soma.co/legacy 2013, and Nick will get your information there and then send you the recordings, because they're not recording them, so we're just kind of sticking a phone in our pocket and going, hey, we'll capture it, make it available. So if you want that, you can get it.
Hoodie Podcast.
Yeah, what?
I said, let's call it Hoodie Podcast.
Is that what it is? Okay, so there you go. I don't know what that means, but...
It's okay now. I'm going to be translating.
Yeah, I know you will. Thank you. That's really what's going on here. Yesterday I was like, what is he talking about? And the answer's in the back going, man, he should have had me up there the whole time.
I didn't say that.
No. So, and then you can follow Leon's or I, because we're going to continue to try and share more and more stuff through Twitter, redirect you to resources that might be helpful. And so if you actually do that, please follow us. And We Are Soma also has a Twitter account that you can follow what we're doing as a larger family of churches in North America. So I wanted to give you that. The definition of a missional community for us is a family of missionary servants. So yesterday when I taught, we basically went through the baptism, our new baptismal identity, which is Trinitarian, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. You're baptized in the name of the Father, so we're the family of God, and we love one another like brothers and sisters. So we're a family. So a missional community loves like family. They care for each other like family. They live like a family would live, because that is one of the ways Jesus said that they'll know you're my disciples, by your love for one another. So they're a family of missionary. They believe that if they receive this, they've been baptized in the Spirit, it means they have the Spirit of God. They've been sent by the Spirit of God to be the missionary people of God in a context. So they're not just loving one another, they're on mission together to a people that needs to know about Jesus and be discipled towards Him and grow up in Him. So, a family of missionary servants. We believe you're baptized in the name of the Son. He's King, Lord of your life. You now are all about His kingdom, breaking in through your life and through the community into the world so the world can see what it looks like to submit to the rule and reign of Christ in all things. So a family of missionary servants. We love like family. We're sent to share the good news, and we serve in such a way that they see what Jesus' rule and reign can look like in their life, in their world. And then the last part is sent as disciples who make disciples. So we believe a mission community is a family of missionary servants sent as disciples who make disciples.
Now, although we love that definition and affirm that definition completely, the hard part about being in Atlanta is that terms like disciple, terms like missionary, even terms like servant are so overworn and so overused that they've lost their power. In a place like the Northwest, where there's more dogs than children and Christians, you bring...
It's true.
Am I lying?
True.
That's a fact. That's not a joke, even though it is incredibly hilarious. But in a place like the Northwest, you can bring in more readily extrapolated biblical language, and it is not warmed over. I'll give you an example. We did some street evangelism that's not recommended. That's just something I like to do for fun sometimes. Every African American I talked to at the Sweet Auburn Festival in Atlanta, every single one said they were Christian. Yes. Every single one. 100 for 100. So when I say Christian, when I say missionary, when I say disciple, it is happy hands on deck. And so the way that we've defined missional community for us is a bullet much more concise, because in it we can wrap all our languages. So we say a missional community is an outward-facing family. An outward-facing family. Because in Atlanta, family is important. In the South, family is important. In African-American, Hispanic cultures, very, very important. And in all cultures especially, that idea of being family is something that people can grab onto. But we wrapped missionary, we wrapped servant, we wrapped disciple in this idea of being outward-facing. That we're not here just to serve one another, but that we're actually here to see and serve the city. And that we're actually here to see the mission of Jesus go forward as an outward-facing family, not an inward-facing family. Because those words that are very incredible and biblical and driven by the Spirit of God have lost some of the power in my culture because everybody's a Christian. And so we have to circumvent their understanding and come around the backside and pull them back to the middle and unpack the language for them so that they understand what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I think another example is we have churches in Idaho, Boise. And what does missionary mean in Idaho? Mormon.
Yeah.
Okay, so you got to think about the language you're using and the context you're in, and so they had to use a different word to help people understand the sent nature of the church. And so, in fact, we'll tell a little bit of our story, how we started, and you'll even start to see the differences. And what we want you to think through is, how would you apply the same principles in your context and actually have to wrestle with language, wrestle with practice, wrestle with holding to the same concept but in a different way in a certain situation. And you'll even find, and as we talk, even in Tacoma, and this will be the same in Atlanta, our missional communities all don't look the same. I mean, they're all different depending on the people that God sent them to reach.
Yeah.
And so we treat them really like, what if you sent a core group to another part of the world and they were going to reach that part of the world? They would have to learn the languages, learn the culture, engage in the rhythms of life, be amongst the people in such a way that they became familiar with how to speak, how to live, how to love, how to serve. What would good news sound like to them, but still it's Jesus? What would it look like to serve them so the kingdom gets visualized there? All that. Very different. And even in cities, from one neighbor to another, it can be totally different.
Yeah.
Now, here in Chicago, there's 77 neighborhoods. I know Legacy is trying to have at least one, they call them house church. It's the same idea, though, as a mission community, per neighborhood. And each one of them is going to do different kind of work and look different and work on different aspects of showing the kingdom to that place, because every neighborhood has different needs. So you got to think through that. When you have a one-size-fits-all mentality of church, you're going to have a very monolithic culture of that church, and you're only going to reach a certain kind of people in a city. And so the beauty, I think, of missional community is it allows your people to work on unique expressions of the church on mission and still be a part of one family or one body as a church in a city.
Yeah, in the second part of this, we're going to, at 4:15, we'll unpack some of the tactical aspects of the story that we're going to unfold right now, and what it means to go in and do the hard work of contextualization and everything that Jeff just said, shorthand, basically parachuting into a culture. If you went to China, you wouldn't go to a storefront and just start preaching. But somehow we've lost that on American culture and assumed the Christianity that doesn't exist. I think the statistic is if you put together all the unbelievers in America, it'd be the third largest country in the world. So we have a false sense of Christendom that no longer exists. And so we still approach making disciples as event-based opportunities when people are past that. We're in a post-Christian society. And so for every one of you guys, it's considering that, understanding who you're going to, and understanding how that's going to unfold, how the gospel is going to reach them, how they're going to receive that, and what are the pathways they have to walk to get there. So we'll get to some of the tactical pieces in the second part of this as well, after we unpack our stories.
Yeah. So we're going to do that now, and then we'll do some Q&A as well. But just know that Leon's will be going a lot more towards breaking it down in the second session today. Okay. So when we first moved back to the Northwest, my wife and I, with our newborn baby, the question that was in front of us was, how do we engage in building a church from the people in our city in such a way that everybody will be on the front line of ministry and mission? That was the question in front of us. It's no longer how do we build a church, it's how do we create a people who are equipped and sent into all of life, and everybody knows they're a minister of the gospel. How do we do that? Which led us to the conviction that you've got to give them something they can actually do. Because very few people can pull off a Sunday event as their primary way of being church. And we're in the Northwest, and if you start an event on Sunday to try and reach everybody, it'll be you and your family showing up. I mean, that's just, they don't go to church. Other parts of the country they do. You'll hear that from Leon's, but not us. So I've seen dozens of churches die out in a year or two in the Northwest because they just tried to do a Sunday event and nobody came to it. So we couldn't do that. So we started by just saying, well, I guess we're going to have to start at the ground level. We'll just start opening our home. We'll have a barbecue every Friday night. We'll start inviting our friends that we meet in our neighborhood over. First, nobody came. People said, yeah, people don't do that here. And I said, well, we're going to start doing that here. And so we're going to bring the party to the neighborhood. Started having a party every Friday night, inviting them over. As we would eat together and party together, we'd get to know their story. As we got to know their story, we found out their real needs. Then we said, okay, now you bring the kingdom of God to bear to their real needs because we're a people blessed to be a blessing. As we care for them and love them, they start asking, why in the world would you do this? Some of you have heard me tell the story of Nikki, my neighbor, who was a widow recluse who had been without her husband for 15 years and didn't talk to anybody. And so we just said, well, let's care for her like she was family, because that's what we are. We're a family who reach out and love others like they're the family, even though they don't yet believe in our Father and His Son, Jesus. And so just love her like a family, care for her. So we started doing that. Of course, the neighbors are going, why would you do that? We've been sitting here for 15 years. I mean, I even had one Christian in my neighborhood come to me going, you know what, it ain't going to work. We used to cut her lawn and care for her, and she just rejected us over and over again. So, well, that doesn't mean you stop loving her. Mm-hmm. You know, you just keep loving her. I mean, think about what Jesus did for you. He didn't give up on you because you didn't respond right away. Like, He just pursues you and pursues you and pursues you.
But that's kind of our general posture. And that is the danger of what Jeff and I routinely use called drive-by evangelism. Even servant evangelism. We're going to do just enough to have the one conversation, and then if you don't respond to the one conversation, we're going to move on to the next person. That is not birthed out of the gospel. That is not birthed out of the heart of Jesus. I didn't want to cut you off.
No, it's great. This is how we do team.
Yeah, that's how we do it.
Keep it going.
So I really want you to consider that, because we've all been guilty of that. I've been guilty of that. 3 conversations and I'm done. I was taught that in seminary. You got 3 conversations, get them to the book of John. If they don't accept the book of John, then you move on to the next person. Because God is sovereign, He'll save them in His time. Well, God is sovereign, also use people to push His kingdom forward. And that doesn't mean that we take our hands off when the first response is not what we want. That's a lazy approach to evangelism. And it lacks love and it lacks life. But that's what we've been cultured into. And so then we wonder why neighborhoods and neighbors are hostile toward the church? Well, it's because the church has always had a usury relationship with people rather than a servant relationship with them.
Yeah. Even to give you a good illustration of that, before I say that, think about Paul. Like, he's in Ephesus for a couple of years. And he says he now could say that all of Asia had heard the gospel. Like, okay, that's some devotion, man. He just stayed. He gave, and he said, I gave you my life. You saw how I lived amongst you. Like, he understood what Jesus did, and that Jesus spent 33 years, only 3 of which were his full ministry years, 30 of which was identifying with humanity.
That's right.
You know, there's something that we need to learn in that, in the example of our Lord. And here is the creator of the universe, could have just showed up in one day and said, I'm going to give it to you all, and then we're going to get out of here. And he didn't. He identified with us. He suffered in every way as we do. He was tempted in every way but did not sin. And so if you're going to be a missionary in your culture, you have got to get into it enough so that you are one of them. Right now we have someone who's we're looking to have move into Portland to do work, and I'm talking to some of the team there, and they were like, the guy's got to be there a couple of years probably before anybody in Portland's going to trust him, because Portland is anti-anybody from outside coming in. I mean, they will be suspect of you for a long time. And there's a lot of reasons why people in the Northwest are suspect about Christians, because they've been used by Christians. My neighbors across the street, they came to me one time. We were in the middle of getting to know them, loving them, caring for them, and we have a real friendship. I mean, we love them. I've told them, whether you believe or not, I will love you. Like I'm really upfront with a lot of my friends. I say, a lot of times you've probably felt like you're a project for Christians. I want you to be my friend. It's not my job to get you to believe anything. That's God's Spirit. He does that work. My job is to just let you know what the love of God looks like in all of life and tell you why. Because I'll tell you about Jesus. I'm going to be real honest about that. But I don't feel any necessity whatsoever to try and get you to believe something, because that's not something I can do. That's something the Spirit of God will do. Yeah. So it takes it off, and they're like, wow, man, I'm glad you were straight up with that. Just remove that problem. Nobody can misunderstand, hopefully. But they came to me one time and said, these neighbors across the street said, we got to let you in on something. Our daughters were invited to this kids event at the big church down the road. And they went to it, and they got all of our information from our kids. Email, all that kind of stuff. And we realized they were using our kids to get to us. Now, I'm just telling you how they perceived it. Now, I know the church. I don't think that's what they would say. But that's how they perceived it, because the next thing was cold calls, emails, come to our event. And they're going, we know what's going on. It's a big church in town. They just want the church to get bigger. It's just their ego they're trying to build on the backs of our kids. They felt abused and used. Yeah. And the church didn't take time to get into their world and go, hey, what is it like when people do this? So that's what we did. We would have people over, eat meals. And as we listened, we started to realize they had a lot of reasons why they were not giving a hearing to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And as we found out what those reasons were, we said, okay, we're going to have to be wise and careful as we engage in ministry with these people, because we cannot assume they'll come to faith the way we came to faith.
That's right.
That's just not how it's going to work. And so we then began to adopt, okay, well, it looks like they care about their neighborhood, because as we're calling them in to care for our neighbor, Nikki, they're showing up, they're serving, they're getting to know her, they're watching us love her. And every time that we would have an opportunity to serve, we were saying, let's create a gospel metaphor through which we tell the gospel to them. So, for instance, one of the neighbors across the street from us, he would often put glued pieces of paper on your windshield because you parked in front of his parking spot that was clearly marked that you were not supposed to park there. And he's a seminary professor in our town, and it said something like, what is wrong with you? How can you not read? And then just a whole bunch of other wonderful, encouraging words.
So Jesus-like.
It is, yeah. That's how God comes. And he and I actually had a discussion about this. I said, do you understand the image of Christ that you're putting into our neighborhood? He goes, that's what Jesus is like. He's a righteous judge. He's going to come and get people. And I'm like, he forgave you, buddy. Come on now. He didn't glue a sticker on you and say, sinner. Everybody I hate you. And we debated on this issue. So then we're having a party at our house, because we just started doing Sunday morning brunches, because we're like, okay, where are all the unbelievers? They're not in a church. They're at home on Sunday morning.
That's right.
So we just started using Sunday morning for a season to reach out to the unbelievers. We call them breakfast clubs, and we just started to have them all over the town, all over the city, and everyone would throw a breakfast, and they'd invite all their neighbors over, and we'd eat, and we'd celebrate, and we'd have fun, and They couldn't believe Christians were doing this because aren't you supposed to be in church on Sunday? And we got to redefine church for them and say, hey, no, we're having church right here. Like we're eating together. We're going to talk with one another. We're going to encourage you. And also we got to redefine for them what they thought. They thought church was something else. They didn't realize it was people engaging in life together around somebody they love a lot and happened to be Jesus.
Yeah.
And so we'd have those conversations. One time we were having breakfast and they were talking about my neighbor who likes to do this to one another's, to people's windshields. And a lot of our friends' windshields were destroyed because to get it off, you got to scrape it and it destroyed them. And so they're tearing him apart. And I think they have every right to if you just look at what he did. It's not good. But at one point I stopped and I said, hey, hold on. We just had that guy over for dinner Friday night. And immediately they're like, what? And it was crazy. They said, don't you understand he was in the military? That guy is he's like a hired killer. We think he's got dead bodies in the basement. I mean, they just start describing the craziness of this. They think he is like the most dangerous man on our block. And here he is, a seminary professor at the local seminary. And you think the work that I've got to do now to get rid of the barriers and build bridges for the gospel, it's a lot of work. But in that moment I said, hey, you know what? We had him over. He's actually a really nice guy. And they're like, no, he's not. So he brought my wife flowers, and he brought us a bottle of wine to eat at the meal, and we had a nice time together.
But you didn't drink that wine.
Of course not, because I don't
South
do
Christians don't drink.
Yeah, I know. That's a different That's the South, though.
Christians don't drink down there.
There you go. Leon's doesn't, does he?
Only in private.
All right. Yeah, like Chicago or something.
I don't know what you're talking about. That was Sprite.
Yeah.
And?
Yeah. So in that moment, I'm like, they brought flowers, brought a bottle of wine, and I said, he told us his story. And you don't know this man. He's been deeply wounded and hurt. There's a really bad father wound there. He's been deeply hurt. He likes justice because he doesn't want people to get hurt. You're misunderstanding. I know it's wrong what he's doing. I don't affirm it. And I'm really hoping there's going to be a day when we're all going to be reconciled in this neighborhood, and we're going to be able to look each other in the eye and say, man, I forgive you. And these are all non-Christians. Not one of them's a Christian in the room. And I'm just talking to them about reconciliation and how we can be restored in a relationship in this neighborhood. And I do believe that in Jesus' ability to change our hearts and to forgive us. And I'm sorry that you aren't getting that from him, but it is true. And so I take this moment to share with them about what he's like. And the next day, my neighbor who's across the street, who I was telling you about how her experience with the church, she pulls me aside and she says, I don't get it. Why in the world would you do something like that? That guy's a jerk. And I said, now that was a gospel metaphor, right?
Yeah.
I said, here's the deal. Jesus is my advocate right now before God the Father. I'm the jerk. I'm the sinner. I'm the one who should be discarded. I'm the one who should be destroyed because of my sin. And instead, God in Christ has accepted me and forgiven me and loved me. And Jesus is my advocate in the place where I can advocate for myself. That's all I was doing for him was the same thing that was done to me by Jesus. And she's just like, I don't get you people. But here's what happened. You know what? In my neighborhood, we are now trusted. Because we expressed an attribute of who God is in Christ Jesus for us that every human wants to be true for one of their friends for them. Mm-hmm. They know we're not going to let that happen to anybody in our neighborhood.
That's right.
That's the kind of stuff we started doing, and it started building trust. It began to build bridges, and eventually people started to join us and eating with us, and more. Not everybody came to faith. We have a ton of people that still don't believe. But what happened is they became the mouthpieces of what we were doing to all the other friends that they had. Mm-hmm. They would tell others, hey, I'm not really into this, but you might be. And then they'd invite them to a party, and then they'd introduce me. And pretty soon I'm getting new core members that are joining us simply because unbelievers are inviting them to join us.
Yeah.
Okay? I would hang out at the same coffee shop over and over again, same restaurants, get to know them. I'd always over-tip. Another gospel metaphor, grace given to those even if their service isn't great, because that's what God's done to us in Christ.
That's right.
So I get to know the waitresses and the waiters. And one of our first conversions is a woman named Cheryl. I go to the same restaurant over and over and over again. One day, and I'd always ask her, how are you doing? And she'd say, I'm fine. I'd go, what does that mean? And I'd ask her next question. And one day I did that. And she goes, I don't get it. Everybody else asks how you're doing, and they stop. You ask how I'm doing, and you actually care. Why do you care about me? You don't have a clue who I am. And then I began to share again the truths of the gospel and how God pursues people. And he did it in Christ. And she starts to weep. We're literally sitting in the restaurant. She starts bawling her eyes out. She says, I don't get, why are you here? I said, God sent me here. I'm here because he sent me to you so that you would hear about Jesus today. And she just bawled. And then I said, how can we help? You're obviously struggling. What's going on? She said, I'm all alone. I'm in a house. It's falling apart. I'm working late nights to try and fix it, working 2 jobs to try and pay for it. I have no help. I said, you have help now. I had a bunch of guys that had come into my corps that were in construction. And I said, we're going to send help. And they started to serve her and care for her. And the next thing you know, she's at our gathering on Sunday while we're breaking bread. She doesn't want to break bread. She doesn't believe in the gospel, so we just keep preaching the gospel and loving her and serving her. And I remember the day when she walked forward with one of the older women who came to be a part of our original corps, and they walk up to the table, and she serves her communion for the first time, and she accepts it. She says, I believe this. And that's how we built our church. It was starting on the ground level, in neighborhood, in meals, in restaurants, in coffee shops, just sharing the gospel through metaphors of servanthood. And then God gave us a corps. And we gathered them together and equipped them and trained them. And we went from 1 missional community to 4. Our goal was, let's train up a bunch of people, send them out, have them start their own missional communities and do the same thing we did in our neighborhood, in our restaurants and coffee shops, in the place they are in our city. And that just continued to multiply. We gathered them together. And that's how we raised up all of our elders. So our elders had to lead a missional community, make disciples, be able to teach others to do the same, be examples of what it means to be on mission. And therefore the people who oversee our church are the people who are examples to our church in the things that we're expecting everybody to do. So that's kind of how our story worked. We had to start on the ground level, the nitty-gritty, the kind of a not normal look of church. Because in the Northwest, you just couldn't. You just couldn't. And by God's grace, God's still growing us. And we have about 700 or 800 in missional communities that are doing that same kind of work. So it's been a good journey. And then along the way, we kind of met each other. And why don't you tell them a little bit of your story, and then we'll kind of tease out some of the uniquenesses of each one.
Yeah, so my story is quite a bit different. I did not have this heart or this philosophy coming into church planting. I was an associate pastor at a mega church. Mega church is not bad. Don't hear me say that. I think some of the best churches in our nation are 2,000 or larger. They're doing great work. Austin Stone, one of the finest examples I've ever seen. But I had come from a church that didn't do great work. They had about 100 groups. Groups were a means of closing the back door to keep people who came in the gathering feeling connected. That was the only reason they did groups. The church was a couple thousand people, and so that's all I had ever seen. I didn't grow up Christian. I grew up Catholic. Came to faith late in high school, and then went to the University of Oklahoma. Wild out. That was primarily the fault of the Catholics. You know the news. You know what time it is. Jesus train wrecked me and got me back on track, and so I didn't have a Christian framework to work from. So the first church that I got connected to was a large church, and that's where I learned how to, quote, do church. So we left the church there and moved to Atlanta. I do not suggest this for anybody, a parachute plant where you just jump into a city that you've never lived in unless the Lord absolutely tells you to do it. And maybe pray for a burning bush before that happens. But we jumped into Atlanta, and I had an incredible plan. This is the way my mind works, and I'm not saying that out of arrogance. I'm going to show you how the Lord blew it up. But that's how my mind works. I'm a strategist. And so I looked at all the demographic data. We wanted to plant a transcultural church. I don't use multicultural. I don't like it. It still delineates and still denotes separation. Transcultural is a church that supersedes culture while holding the beauty of the individual values that God has created in each one of us. And so we wanted to do that. And I had a great plan. I had a great neighborhood, Grant Park, 45% African American, 45% white, 10% other. We're going to move there. We're going to make a few friends, and then we're going to blow this thing up. Well, none of my plan worked. Nothing worked. Nothing I did worked. Because here's a strange thing, especially if you're in the South or going to the South, you need to understand. The South is as post-Christian as the Northwest, but the South is holding that post-Christian posture with antebellum religiosity laid over the top of it. Okay, so it's a weird dynamic. Everybody's Christian, but nobody's Christian. And there are as many people missing Sunday mornings there in a line at Ria's Bluebird, which has the best burrito I've ever had in my life. Breakfast. I would skip church for that. And they're wrapped around the building every Sunday morning. When we drive to worship, we see them every Sunday morning. The park is a place for worship in Atlanta, one of the healthiest cities in downtown. And so everybody's walking their dogs and running around the park on Sunday morning. Even brown folk. I didn't know that existed. 2 brown people were running. I was like, is this real? Am I seeing? Because I'm from New Orleans. I grew up in the 9th Ward and moved to Baton Rouge. So I had never seen brown people of that sort. And so we came in with this phenomenal plan. And we gathered a core team very, very quickly. And that fell apart. And then we gathered a second core team very, very quickly. And that fell apart. And it just kept falling apart. And I kept falling on my face. And my plan kept dissolving itself. And then one day I just had an epiphany. I spent a couple years in mission work in South America, in Cambodia, in Nepal. And I realized that I was doing the exact opposite of what I'd been trained as a missionary who would come into a new city after I come into a new city. I had taken a Christendom model of church, if you build it, they will come, and tried to apply it to a city that was already filled with megachurches. Atlanta is second in the nation to megachurches, except for Dallas. And Dallas might be a country. We don't even know what that is. So we can't. So we might be first.
It's not even fair to compare.
It's not even fair. I'm just like, China and Japan would fit in Dallas.
I always tell my friends, you plant a church in Dallas, you will grow. It doesn't matter.
It doesn't
if
even matter.
Anything.
Like, hey, Jesus. Whole 1,000 people show up. It's amazing. It's incredible. So these were all the tensions that existed. The people who wanted church, as usual, were already in church. They were with Creflo, they were with Eddie, they were with Andy, they were with Dr. Morton, they were with Louis. The people who wanted church were already in church. And so the idea of a new church just wasn't going to happen. I didn't find out until later that within the previous 5 years, there had been over 20 church plant attempts in that neighborhood that all tanked. Every single one of them. So I came to this epiphany that what I'm trying to do is not working. The only other thing that I know is to do what I learned when I went to Cambodia, which was to eat rice and listen. And so that's what I started doing. I started meeting my neighbors and listening to their stories, listening to their hurts, their pains, their fears, their doubts. We probably had somebody over for dinner 5 out of 7 nights a week, sometimes 6. I spent my days in coffee shops and at bars drinking water and eating peanuts. And having lots and lots of conversations. There's something in us that does not see value in presence. I don't know what that is. But I would argue that presence itself is ministry. Jesus did it. Jeff just said for 30 years before he said a word to anybody. And so what started off as 9 months of rise, fail, rise, fail, rise, fail, rise, fail turned into 2.5 years of sitting, listening, and waiting. Now, here's the ego part, right? I left my church, and I say this tongue-in-cheek and with complete silliness, a star. Like I was going to go down to Atlanta and blow it up. And every other conversation, my wife would tell you, coming out of our old churches, man, when y'all start services? Man, you down there preaching yet? Man, when y'all start service? And every time I'm like, well, no, we haven't started service yet. Well, what you doing? Well, we're getting to know our neighbors. Well, when you going to start the church? I'm starting the church. And how you start no church? That was a conversation. I had to do the hard work of getting a job. Best thing you could ever do. Because then you get to learn what the daily grind is like. That's where I learned that 80% of Atlantans are commuting over 45 minutes every single day. That's why the if you build it, they will come culture works for people who want a church because they're already driving all over the place. So I met one lady who worked in Midtown, lived in Stone Mountain and went to church in Kennesaw. Now, y'all may not know exactly what that means, but that's about a 100-mile loop for her life. She didn't have a sense of place or a sense of presence in anything that she did. And you can't know those things from reading demographic studies. You can't know those things from doing online research. You got to be on the ground. But it took me continued and immense failure before I would let that sink into my head, into my heart. And so we just backed up. We backed up and reevaluated the whole strategy. I stopped talking about the church at all. I didn't mention it for 2.5 years. I got to know my neighbor. My best friend in Atlanta is an atheist. He taught me more than anybody else did. First conversation we ever had, he said to me, he didn't know I was a pastor. He said to me, I wish somebody would take all clergy, put them in a barrel, and throw them in the sea. And I was like, I'm in nonprofit work. That's what I do. I used to play pro ball, and now I work in nonprofits. What kind of nonprofit? All types of nonprofits.
City transformation.
City evolution, government education. I just started naming stuff because this dude was so hostile toward the gospel. And when I use a term like post-Christian overlaid with antebellum religiosity, that's where I learned is that there is a competing dynamic, especially in the urban core of Atlanta, even among African Americans and Hispanics, that there is a rising disillusionment with the idea of church, but a desire to hold on to a false constructed value system that they thought the church gave them. And what we have to give them in the middle of that is Jesus. So we began to do that, and we stopped talking core group, and we just started gathering people in our home for a meal, and I called it a conversation about worldview. That's what it was, just a worldview conversation. And so we would get together and we would talk, and the last 15 minutes, I would either break out the scriptures or break out a verse or break out something and say, well, here's what I think and here's why. And that's when the conversation would really start. Two of the best things that ever came out of those and most hilarious memories I have is one girl saying that the blind man in John 9 wanted to be blind and that we shouldn't always be looking for an outside force to fix us. And somebody else who was also not a Christian looked at her and said, so blind people want to be blind? I don't know about the Jesus thing, but I'm pretty sure blind people don't want to be blind. The second was a brother named Junebug. Every one of y'all got a cousin named Junebug. Don't front. He got gold teeth. He's still wearing FUBU jeans. You know. And Junebug had grown up in the church. He had grown up in the church, and we're sitting there having this worldview conversation. And he says, man, if we knew our true spiritual power, we could fly around the universe like Hancock. And he follows that by saying, I don't know, we were them trees out there. And this is the second time. This is the beautiful thing about creating a gospel ecosystem. People begin to say things they don't even know why they're saying. The second time, a non-Christian looked at somebody else and said, listen, I'm not totally sure about this Jesus thing, but I'm pretty sure we were never trees. Okay. What faith system did she just cast down right there? Anybody know? Pantheism and panentheism. The belief that we are one with nature and one with the earth. This was a spiritualist girl who did yoga. And not that yoga's bad, I'm just saying that was her religion. It was yoga. But here she is rebuking a supposed Christian about pantheism. She's been gospeled and she didn't even know it in these worldview conversations. And so that's what we did, and we began to see people come to faith. The first lady that came to faith in our story was that woman Audrey, who we subsequently sent to Haiti to be a missionary. She's been there for 2 years. And people began to come to Jesus. And then we started our first, what we call city groups. Again, this is language. We said missional community. It would just be seen as another church thing in a church culture. In an anti-church culture, that seems like something like interesting. Like, wow, what could that be about? In our culture, they just hear small groups.
Yeah.
So we call them city groups. Let's take what they already know, but we're going to reframe it. We're in the city. We got groups, city groups. Nothing fantastic about it. Right? And we started 1, and then multiplied to 2, and then multiplied to 3. And then those 3 city groups, quote, launched our church publicly the weekend of Dr. King's birthday in 2011. Now, Jeff didn't say this because he wanted me to. This is not anti-gathering. This is the both and. The reality that the gathering is a place for the body to renew their covenant, to celebrate Jesus, to break bread together, and to sit passively under the preached word of the gospel. And the group that is the primary organizing structure for discipleship, where they apply what is said in the gathering. And so we don't see those things as competing against one another. They're complementary. They're a greater part of our discipleship ecosystem. And so those 3 groups launched our gathering, and in 2.5 years, God has been incredibly favorable to us. 2.5 years, almost 700 people, over 150 people baptized, brand new Christians. And we've seen God work incredibly. But it took failing and failing and failing and failing and failing to understand that this whole idea of if you build it, they will come may draw people who are already sitting in somebody else's pews, but it's not going to make converts, and it's certainly not going to make disciples. And so that's kind of our story. I wish I had gone in the way you went in, but I want it to be awesome. And God quickly showed me how unawesome I was.
You know what's interesting, it's always good for me to hear other people tell their story, and as I was listening to Leon's, one of the things that we realized as we saw the gathering and the mission in everyday life, and people were living on mission in everyday life, it changes what happens when you gather.
That's exactly right.
You know, like, they're eager to sing. They desire to hear the good news preached. They want to be reminded of that it's worth it, that Jesus gave his life for them.
And they bring people and don't have to be told to bring people. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Come in droves.
Yeah. And I'd say Leon's has done an incredible job in really finding that tension in the South of how important a gathering is for many people, and yet infusing it with gospel-centered preaching, communion as a regular reminder of what this is all about, remembering Jesus on a weekly basis, which for a lot of people in the South, they don't take communion regularly.
No.
You know?
Once a quarter.
Yeah.
Maybe a couple times a year, Easter and Christmas.
So he took what was in place, that was a fairly normal cultural rhythm, but he infused it with gospel centrality, and he got people on mission and not just attending.
Yeah.
And that's changed. I mean, I've been in their gathering, and man, it was amazing. It was so much fun to sing, to celebrate, to hear the word preached, and to know I'm with a bunch of other brothers and sisters who are living this out in the day-to-day. That changes the experience of the believer when they're not alone in this mission out there all week long. I mean, we need that. And then it makes sense when you read Hebrews 10, let us not give up meeting together as some in their habit of doing, but let us encourage one another and spur one another on toward love and good deeds. And you go, I get it. That's a bunch of people who are out losing their lives or risking their lives for the sake of Jesus all week long. And when they're coming together, they're going, man, I just need to be reminded. He rose from the dead, right? He really did conquer this sin and death, and I can face my death, and it's okay. I might get killed this week. It'll be good to see you next week if we make it back. Can you imagine what that must have been like for the early church, to have that be a normal reality for us? And we're out like, man, I don't know, man. I'd hate to give up another really nice, fancy meal and have to eat with people. Or let people in my home because they might steal something, or, you know, like, I got to protect my kids from the world because, man, the last thing I want is for any of us to die for Jesus. But, I mean, this is the message we are teaching people, is it's better to find comfort first and live for the commission of Jesus second, instead of live out the commission of Jesus first and being willing to die. Like he said, if you follow me, you're probably going to get persecuted. You will suffer if you're my disciples. I'm just going to promise you that on the front end. That's the message we got to give the church, because they have forgotten that the greatest adventure they could ever live would be to live for Christ and to die and know it's gain.
Yeah.
Like that's what they need to know, because, man, what if you get your life taken, you get to go be with Jesus? Why in the world would you want to stay here?
Yeah.
Right? Like, take me home.
Yeah.
And the more that you get to know Jesus, the more that you'll actually say that with your heart.
Yeah.
Because you realize He's way better than anything you've got here. And the world doesn't know that because we don't believe it.
And we certainly don't live
like it. Yeah.
And what that does is reframe the gathering. And that doesn't mean everybody's going to come along right out of the gate. Okay, we still, I mean, just being fair, because we're in downtown Atlanta, we've got a good production. Got a high, I mean, Medina will tell you, it's a high quality production. And I use that word loosely.
You got professional musicians.
We have some professional musicians that serve. We don't pay nobody. That's just my own ethic. You don't have to do that. But we have professional musicians that serve. So we're not putting together something shoddy. But the reality is that we want people to understand theologically that this is a regrouping. There's a regrouping and ascending that happens every Sunday. And that the life of the church is Monday through Saturday. Sunday is my time to renew covenant with God, renew covenant with you. Remember again that Jesus is real, that he did die, that he did rise, that he is coming, and that we are moving toward a kingdom that is far greater than the one in which we exist. And then we feel empowered, strengthened, encouraged to be sent again. And after we go out and we have a horrible week at work, and the one person that we knew was going to believe this week cuss us out, and our kids, don't act like you ain't never been cussed out. If you ain't been cussed out for Jesus, you ain't living for Jesus. All right? So, you know, and your boss crazy, and your wife crazy, and your children crazy, and you're having a hard time believing the gospel, and you're limping through the week. There is a renewing aspect that happens in the community, in the missional community, the outward-facing family, and then you're strengthened again in the middle of the week, and you run through Sunday, and you're strengthened again. And that's how it's got to be seen as a rhythm of life. Not that the gathering is it, that is the show, that is the detonating point, that is the goal. The gathering is never the goal. Growth is never the goal. Discipleship is the goal. The planting of the gospel is the goal. The multiplication of communities is the goal, and growth will happen. And that's what's missed a lot of times here. And we don't throw out numbers just to throw out numbers. But the reality is, at 900 people, okay, Soma, Tacoma is in the top 5% of churches by size. At almost 700, so is ours. So we're not anti-growth, we're not anti-gathering, but what we're saying is if that's the goal, then you'll miss discipleship. If discipleship is the goal, mission is the goal, community is the goal, that stuff will happen. It'll happen. Because the Spirit will bless it, and you'll see multiplication that you cannot control, nor can you handle. And you'll watch God do something incredible.